Hello, cooking enthusiasts. Today's video is about actually making flavored ramen noodles and is a follow-up to my ramen flour experiment. Before we get started, just a reminder that next week is going to be a Q&A video, so please leave me any questions you have in general in the comments. Straight away, this is not any kind of standard noodle or ramen making procedure. Of course, the big difference is that we'll be using my experimental alkaline pre-treated flour. If you haven't seen that video, I recommend you go watch it. And we'll also be air drying these noodles afterward. I've seen this for many types of noodles, but in general, I see fresh ramen either cooked right away or frozen, but I prefer drying. Here is the basic recipe for mustard noodles. 150 grams of ramen flour, 150 grams of strong or bread flour. White is definitely necessary. Mustard powder, 20 grams. Black pepper, 4.5 grams of freshly and finely ground pepper. 150 grams of yellow mustard, anything smooth will work, and water as needed. Now, this may seem like a lot of mustard, and it is, but there are a few things to remember. One, in general, flavored noodles need to be very strongly flavored. Otherwise, they get overwhelmed by the dish they're in. The other thing to make note of is that mustard is a very heat-sensitive flavor. It loses a lot of its sharp punch when boiled, so the black pepper is there to just give a little bit of heat back into the flavor. You'll want to start by combining your dry ingredients first, and then stir in your mustard. I would recommend switching quickly to working it in with a gloved hand. Again, there's no definitive amount of water I can recommend, since it's going to depend both on your environment and the moisture level of your mustard. For me, the 150 grams of yellow mustard got me most of the way there, but you'll need to incorporate at least several teaspoons of water until you have a cohesive dough that isn't crumbly at all. For my setup, I would rather slightly overhydrate than underhydrate, given that it is a tough dough to roll out. Obviously, if you find it starts sticking down the road, you can add a little bit of flour as needed. Once you have a dough ball you're happy with, you can vacuum pack it for rapid hydration, or simply let it rest in the fridge, tightly wrapped in plastic. One warning I will give: if you make this much dough, or even more, only work with it in about 200-gram portions. I found that if I tried to work with too much dough at one time, the sheets of dough started to dry out and became very tough. Eventually, they become so tough that you can't repair them or laminate them together with the rollers. After a half hour of resting, you want to cut your dough ball roughly in half, put the other half back in the fridge wrapped up, and start rolling out your dough with a rolling pin so it's thin enough to put into the machine. If you're using a manual pasta roller, I recommend having 2 people. Put your roller on the largest setting, which for me was number 1. It's perfectly normal to have the sheet of dough look a little raggedy and ripped in the first attempt, but just keep rolling and folding it until you get a nice cohesive sheet of dough. As I mentioned, the dough is tough, so if you're having issues with ripping and making repairs, I recommend rolling any pieces of dough through the roller from 1 to 2 to 3. Once they're at number 3, they seem easy enough to layer together and press together back on number 1. If things are going smoothly, it's recommended to roll and fold your sheet of dough for several times on the same number in your roller in order to stretch and align the gluten. But if you're having trouble, just be happy with getting a cohesive sheet. Once you have a cohesive sheet at the thickest setting, you want to turn your roller to the next setting, which is number 2. Once you have a sheet of dough at number 2, I recommend cutting it in half, since this amount of dough should be 2 portions of noodles. You then take each sheet of dough and roll it through a number 3 thickness and finally a number 4 thickness. This is where I like to stop for the final texture I'm looking for, and I highly recommend you don't go any thinner. Once you have the sheets of dough at the desired thickness, it's time for the most satisfying part of noodle making, putting it through the cutter. I recommend the thinner cutter you probably have access to with either a manual or automatic roller. I find that things clump together if I leave them in nests, so I like hanging the noodles to dry from either a pole or a string. Once you're done that, you simply repeat the process for the other portion of dough, and you're done. The noodles take about 5 minutes to boil after they've dried, but you'll want to check on them for doneness. And that is how to make mustard flavored ramen. Once I have a few more successes, I'm hoping to make a general guide to making flavored noodles, since it can be tricky, but at the very least, I do recommend playing around with the ramen flour technique. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it interesting. If you did, please consider sharing it and subscribing. If you have any questions about it, or just food questions in general, please leave them in the comments. Otherwise, thank you for watching.